Thank you, Michael. It would be remiss of me as the chair of the session just to remind people, please turn off your cell phones. Also, don't be paging, texting, tweeting, any of that stuff, you know, so we can all have a good, intensive session. And I was remiss when also in introducing Phyllis Bennis. She has two books down at the book table. One, Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, and the other, Ending the U.S. War in Afghanistan. Another reminder about Phyllis's great work. Thank you.
Good afternoon. You know, like Michael's publisher, mine always wants me to sell books. So those two and the one on Iran are available at the Haymarket table. They're little, they're cheap. You can get them at a discount. So please buy them. I don't want to take them back to Washington. It's really what it's all about. I don't care if you read it or not. I mean, I do. Michael, thank you for that overview. It's frightening and maybe a little bit optimistic at the same time. A little bit. I want to move from the broad global to one particular region where we're seeing a particular fight back against empire right now, and that is, of course, in the Middle East, where the Arab Spring has risen in a way that has given new hope and new excitement to a whole generation of people, certainly in that part of the world, but I would assert far broader than that. I think that people all around the world, just as the Occupy movement here inspired people even beyond the areas where Occupy events were taking place, the Arab Spring has come to characterize a whole new generation's fight back against globalization, against neoliberalism, against capitalism in many ways. So I want to talk about that a little bit. The Middle East, of course, has always been, for millennia, the centerpiece of both a strategic region, the meeting point of three continents, resource-rich, important for a whole host of reasons. So in the U.S. side of things, the U.S. strategy for the Middle East was always based since, say, the end of World War II, throughout the years of the Cold War and since, on three things: oil and natural gas, but primarily oil, Israel, and strategic access, which includes markets as well as bases, military bases. And that was true during the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. It's been true in the years since the end of the Cold War, and it's true now in an era where, as we were just hearing from Michael, there is increasing competition in a different way. Rather than having two superpowers contending for power and influence in a given region, we're having this whole question of resource fights that involve corporations much more than governments themselves. But I think that when we look at those three components of U.S. imperial strategy throughout this period, in the immediate period, what we're seeing is that the U.S. is losing on all three fronts. On the question of oil, it lost its goals in Iraq. It lost the war in Iraq. But in so losing, and I don't have time here to go into all the details about sort of what the end of U.S. combat in Iraq means. Obviously, it doesn't mean the end of a U.S. presence. It doesn't mean the end of drone attacks. It doesn't mean the end of special forces operations, et cetera, et cetera. But it does give us one more indication that the U.S. has lost at what their goals were in Iraq, which included gaining control of Iraqi oil, which it does not have, putting in power a pro-U.S. government, which is increasingly evident that it's not the case, a full access to permanent U.S. bases, of which they now have 0, and a government that is not close to Iran, something that they failed dramatically to achieve. So all of those major goals of the United States in Iraq failed. On the question of Israel, right now the U.S.-Israeli relationship remains very, very fraught, particularly on the political side. I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but in an election cycle, the question of how the pro-Israel lobby does and does not participate with the strategic interests involving the Pentagon, the military producers, etc., in maintaining this strategic relationship with Israel is very much in flux right now. We saw during the visit of Bibi Netanyahu to the United States that Obama denied him what he wanted, which was a promise of an immediate war in Iran. That doesn't mean we're out of the woods relative to the possibility of a war in Iran. It is still very much a possibility. But I would say that the Israeli position, the extremist Israeli position, which is, of course, centrist in Israeli politics, given the shift to the right there, has not been matched by the United States. And then, of course, Israel itself is losing a kind of strategic understanding that it had in the region, where it was able to, for so many years, rely on U.S.-imposed relationships with U.S.-backed dictators, most importantly, of course, in Egypt, but in other places as well, where suddenly it's not so clear that Israel can count on the U.S. support for dictators allowing free range of governmental relationships with governments, even while they continued a rhetorical anti-Israel stance. So then on the question of the strategic access in the region, that's where the Arab Spring has posed a massive strategic challenge to the United States. So this is not yet a complete revolutionary process. I would say that the Arab Spring does not yet represent a revolution, but it is, in a number of countries, a revolutionary process that is underway, and it is having the effect, among other things, of denying to the U.S. the assumption that money and arms to regional dictators will allow unfettered access to bases, to markets, to all those things that they have won at such a low price for all these years, relatively low. So if we look at the region, what do we have? In the past, historically, there were two regional hegemons that could imagine competing with the U.S. as the global power. Because in that part of the world, what you need to be a regional power, an indigenous regional power, would be size of land and population, money from oil, and water. And historically, only two countries had all three, Iran and Iraq. So the U.S., after cheering on the Iran-Iraq war because it was going to weaken both of them and cost an enormous amount in resources in both those countries, human and otherwise, the U.S. chooses its sides, goes in on the side of Iraq at first, later decides we're going to go after Iraq, it's an easier target, wipes out Iraq as a potential contender in the regional arena. Iraq is brought to its knees through sanctions and then wars, and it now is very far from being a potential regional challenger. So you might say, well, we only then have Iran. Over the last 10 years, what's changed in that equation was the role of Turkey, which traditionally, the poor country of Europe, they used to say the poor man of Europe, but I don't really like that, since it's women who tend to be much poorer than men anyway, but be that as it may. Turkey is no longer the poor anything. Turkey, very quietly, without oil, using sweatshop labor, manufacturing, tourism, and a bunch of other stuff, managed to come up with the 17th biggest economy in the world. I'm not exactly sure how they did that. I want to study that and figure it out. But nonetheless, they did it, and they are now the contending regional power with Iran. But the big difference is Iran and Iraq spent generations at war or about to go to war with each other. Iran and Turkey don't have that kind of a relationship. They're not best buds, they're not best friends forever, but they have a very cordial relationship. They have huge amounts of trade. They have a respectful competition for regional power. But the notion that there are two regional powers now with the potential to have that kind of dominance in the region is not exactly something the U.S. is very keen to recognize, as we saw recently when Turkey with Brazil, one of its partners in the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, there's other combinations, BASIC, BRIC, all these acronyms about basically the increasingly wealthy and increasingly powerful countries that were once dismissed as just the biggest of the third world, but now are serious contenders for global power. Turkey and Brazil had an initiative to deal with the Iran crisis. It worked. Iran accepted it. Everybody was fine with it, except the U.S. then came in and said, we're not going to let you do that because we don't want it settled on those terms. So in this context, we see the Arab Spring rising. This revolutionary process, not yet a complete revolution, with economic roots to some degree, challenges to the impact of years of neoliberalism, years of crony capitalism, years of disenfranchisement of whole parts of the population, and a political challenge. A political challenge that is not going to give me any time to talk about anything. A political challenge that was the initial spark for this revolution. We have to be very clear that despite the economic realities, the Arab Spring didn't start and is not today primarily a challenge to neoliberalism or to capitalism. It is primarily a political upheaval that is aimed at overturning dictatorships. It's a democratic revolutionary process, not one that is challenging capitalism. I don't have time to go through all the examples of the various countries, but I would just say that despite enormous setbacks in Syria, uncertainty in Yemen, big problems in Libya, potentially great stuff in Tunisia, which probably has the least influence, and we don't know what's going to happen in Egypt, and a bunch of others, Palestine moving forward, it's still an incredibly positive framework for seeing how this change in the region may be happening. So I want to just come back for a minute to the question of the U.S. wars, because I think when we look at the question of the undermining of power of the U.S. empire in the region, we have to look at these sort of political relationships between the U.S. and its regional cohorts, its dictators, you know, the overthrow of Mubarak, et cetera, et cetera. But we can't leave out the enormous impact at the level of politics, at the level of ideology, at the level of economy, at the level of finance, at the level of resources, at every step of the way, the impact of the wars currently being fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Pakistan, the drone wars in Yemen and Somalia, the rising threat of war against Iran. What the world is seeing is an aggressive U.S. military intervention that doesn't have the capacity to do what it wants to do. So the discussion that we're having now about the horrific latest war crime in Afghanistan, and I would just note here that one thing that we never hear about when we hear about how the guy probably snapped, PTSD, too many deployments, I have no doubt that all of that is true. But I just would challenge those who want to sort of make that the main thing we talk about, to think about the fact that according to the Afghan government's health ministry, 66%, two-thirds of the entire population of the country, are suffering from mental illnesses, primarily PTSD and other stress-related illnesses, in a country where there are 42 psychiatrists and psychologists in the entire country. And no one ever talks about some Afghan militant having snapped because he watched his child killed by a drone the night before. So let's just be a little careful when we think about that. That was a side. I just had to say it. But I would say, with other examples, let's have in my Afghanistan book. I think that what's very important is that we not forget the role of these continuing wars that have dropped off the front pages except at moments of absolute war criminality, and the impact they are having, the cost in this country. When Michael talks about how the cost is going to be shared, I'm not sure it'll be equal, but it's certainly going to be shared. It's already being shared. The cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan so far have been over $1.5 trillion. In Afghanistan alone, it costs $1 million a year to keep one young soldier there. For that same $1 million, we could bring that soldier home, hire her and 19 more in a middle-class, $50,000 a year job in this country. What's going to make us safer? So this question of what happens with the wars of empire and who benefits from them and who no longer benefits is something that has to be very much at the centerpiece of how we look at the region, how we look at the changes in U.S. imperial strategy. And finally, if we look back to earlier empires, you know, if we look back to Thucydides writing about in the Melian dialogues, where he talks about the great democrats of Athens who decide they're kind of at risk, they need to expand, they need strategic reach, so they go to the island of Milos. And are any of you classics majors, by the way? No, good. whenever I do this, somebody tells me that I got the translation wrong or something. It's a problem with academics, you know. But it's an incredible story. They go to the island of Milos and say, we're taking your island. And the Melians say, well, we don't think so. And the Athenians say, well, sorry, we're bigger and stronger than you, we're taking your island. And the Melians come back with, what about democracy that you guys are so big on? Where's that in this equation? And the answer is, for us, there is democracy. For you, there is the law of empire. That's the new international law that if we're not very careful will be so dominant that we will no longer even be able to challenge it. Thank you.